Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the history of juvenile justice, and we're going to uncover how arguments from over 100 years ago are somehow still echoing in our courtrooms today. Let's get into it. Now listen to this. This powerful statement was written way back in 1897. It was part of a newspaper article about two young boys found crying in a police watch house, all for allegedly stealing a single pigeon. The author was basically asking a really simple question. Is this what justice is supposed to look like? And here's why that century-old quote feels so incredibly unsettling. On the left, you see that 1897 incident, and on the right, a recent case from Queensland. A teenager spent over a year on remand. That's held in custody before being sentenced, and that included time in the very same type of police watch house. The parallels are just startling, aren't they? And they lead us to the central question for this entire explainer. Why in the world do these echoes persist?
Okay, so to understand the system we have today, we actually have to go way back. Back to a time when the very idea of childhood as we know it was still pretty new. It's a concept we totally take for granted now, but believe it or not, it was once revolutionary.
So to explore this, we're going to act as what one historian calls contemplative geologists. What does that mean? Well, it means we're not just looking at the surface of today's laws. No, we're digging down, layer by layer, to really understand the historical forces that created our juvenile justice system in the first place.
You see, before this massive shift in thinking, the law often made very little distinction between children and adults. But sometime in the 1800s, this new idea really started to take hold, that childhood was this unique, vulnerable period, and that protecting it was the key to setting a person on the right path for their whole life.
And look, this new concern for kids wasn't just some abstract idea. It came from some truly horrific conditions. The institutions that were created for so-called delinquent youth, places like reformatories and industrial schools, were being condemned even back then. One commission described them with that chilling phrase right there, noting that they were basically designed for easy management, not for the well-being of the kids inside.
So in response to these horrors, a really powerful reform movement started to build. And they weren't interested in just making a few small tweaks. They wanted to imagine an entirely different way of doing things. And the reformers' vision was crystal clear. They argued for a system that focused on rehabilitation, not just punishment. They believed that kids needed to be completely separated from the adult system to avoid its influence. And they understood that a child's environment, not just their actions, had to be part of the equation. This campaign was huge. It included charities, politicians, and legal professionals. But women were a particularly powerful force. In Queensland alone, a coalition of 25 different women's organizations came together to analyze the proposed laws, pushing for a system that was more merciful and actually focused on child welfare.
But as it so often goes, turning a powerful vision into actual law is a messy, messy process. That original dream was almost immediately diluted by pragmatism, by politics, and by the deep-seated prejudices of the era.
This slide really shows the gap between that dream and the reality. The vision was for special judges, people with a real talent for dealing with kids. The reality? Often, it was the same police magistrates the reformers worried were already too hardened by the adult system. The vision was for total separation. The reality was a concession that allowed children in prisons if no other shelter was available. The ideal just gave way to the practical.
Now, this is absolutely crucial, a foundational layer our contemplative geologist would uncover. This new merciful system was not designed for all children, not even close. When Queensland created its Children's Court in 1907, the Aboriginal Protection Act had already been in place for 10 years, creating an entirely separate punitive system. It wasn't until the 1960s that First Nations children even began to enter the mainstream juvenile justice system.
A single case from 1922 just perfectly captures these built-in conflicts and really reveals the system's devastating legacy.
So, in 1922, a 13-year-old Aboriginal boy was accused of murdering his employer's wife. As a newspaper put it, suspicion was at once placed on him, despite a lack of direct evidence and some really questionable circumstances. He confessed and was sentenced to life with hard labor. But the story didn't end there. A legal battle blew up that sounds incredibly modern, a debate over adult time for adult crime. The boy's sentence seemed to violate the new Children's Act. The case went all the way to the High Court, which actually agreed that the boy couldn't be sent to prison. But in a final, cynical act of so-called mercy, the government just redesignated the penal institution on Palm Island as a reformatory so they could incarcerate him there anyway. That history of exclusion has a direct,
tragic, and undeniable legacy. This data from Queensland shows that the detention rate for First Nations youth is nearly 30 times higher than for non-Indigenous youth. The seeds of this disparity were planted over a century ago.
And so, we come full circle. The very issues that reformers fought against a century ago are still with us. Children in watch houses, the debate over treating children as adults, a system that disproportionately impacts First Nations children. The echoes are just impossible to ignore.
Those early reformers were pioneers. They were working on intuition, on observation, and on a dream of how things could be different. They didn't have a century of research and data to prove their point. We do. We have overwhelming evidence about what works and what doesn't, and that poses a pretty profound question for us today. I want to end with this thought from child welfare scholar Dorothy Scott. Understanding all this history isn't just an academic exercise. It's a challenge. The reformers of the past had a dream that led them to completely recast their system. As we confront the realities of our own time, well, that is our task too. Thanks for watching.